Welcome to Sleek Notes E-Commerce Boost Podcast, your chance to learn from the e-commerce experts so you can boost your business.
In this episode, you'll hear the founder of Moz, Fishkin, explain how cultural conditioning biases us as humans and as marketers to never really think outside the box and to only do things that has already been done, because that's how it's always been done. Fishkin gives you truly interesting advice on how you can release yourself from these biases and become more innovative and probably a lot happier too. Welcome to the show, Rand.
Thank you for having me, Julie.
If you could just start out by introducing yourself, that would be great.
Oh, sure. So I'm Rand Fishkin. I'm the founder of Moz and co-founder of inbound.org. I am the author of a book that's coming out next year called Lost and Founder. And I'm a very frequent traveler and speaker and a relatively prolific blogger, as well as the host of a video series called Whiteboard Friday.
Amazing. Great. So this episode, we're going to talk about your Inbound 2017 talk. Could you maybe just take us back to when you were planning your talk and what were your themes on what to talk about?
Sure, yeah. So, I get ideas for my talks often from life experiences, right? So something that happens in the real world, or conversation, or a series of conversations that seem to all follow the same thread. And I think that was true of the Inbound talk as well. I noticed this sort of parallel between a lot of the biases that I noticed in cultural conditioning, especially around gender issues and gender norms. And this is probably more true in the United States than it is in other places, but I think most of the Western world is this way. And I saw these parallels between how, men and women wish they could act, and how we actually do, and the connection between that biasing and the biasing that marketers experience, which has to do with all of these various learned behaviors and inherited traits that I don't think are actually helpful or strategically smart, but we do them because we've been conditioned by, our peers and our mentors in the marketing industry, and how things were done before we got, into our space or to our companies, or the conditioning that we get, even if we're solo entrepreneurs, by reading blogs and websites and learning the practice of marketing. I think we all get conditioned in biased ways. And so I decided, I'm going to craft a talk that speaks to both of those, that starts with some of this conditioning around gender norms, and then ties that into the conditioning that biases marketers.
Interesting. And your main point of the talk, correct me if I'm wrong, was that every marketer has to consider, how is cultural conditioning biasing me? Why is this such a necessary question to ask?
Well, I think that the best way to get incredible results is to do something different than how everyone else is doing. And one of the great ways that you can be unique and stand out in your field is to remove the biases that are nudging everyone else towards, this sort of collective failure or collective inability to be as unique or as good as they could be. I truly believe, and I've seen it happen many times, that when we can get out of our past practices, when we can escape the biases and the trappings of our conditioning, we can achieve remarkable results. And I think that's the goal of a lot of marketers, right? Is to achieve something not just normal, not just put in my 40 hours and go home, but to achieve something remarkable. And I think this is a great way to access that.
Yeah, great. So really being aware of these biases also makes us gives us the ability to be more innovative.
Yeah, more innovative, and potentially more logical, right? If we remove the biases, we can say, wait a minute, there's no actual reason that I do this. It's just that I do this because it's always been done that way.
Yeah. And in your talk, you went over 7 of these biases or marketing myths or whatever you call them, which you then debunk. And the first of those were that investments must be measurable. Can you just explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think that it's really interesting how the marketing world, of probably the last century was very challenging to measure, at least in the way we think of measurement today, which is very direct, one-to-one, every dollar spent, every click tracked, every human interaction measured and recorded, every touch, attributed to a channel and to a campaign and an effort. And that really didn't happen until, maybe a decade into the internet. It's cool. It's powerful. It lets us do a lot of really interesting things. But the bias that especially advanced web marketers and those who focus on paid channels have is that if there is a channel or an effort or a campaign that's not measurable in this near perfect way, that it doesn't deserve investment. It doesn't deserve dollars. It doesn't deserve effort or people against it. But in fact, many of the most powerful marketing channels are very, very difficult to measure. And they're also much less competitive because they're so hard to measure, right? I mean, AdWords and Facebook ads are incredibly competitive, and it's extremely hard to get more out of them because all of your competitors are bidding up those ad prices just to the limit of where they can barely eke out, a few pennies in return on investment per visitor. But if you were to go invest in organic search traffic or organic Facebook, which is much harder to measure and much harder to improve and grow, then you would find that those are much less competitive channels, and that in fact the cost of customer acquisition is dramatically lower. And I think you find that even more so in the fields of content marketing and in brand marketing, where it's very difficult to measure indeed, but the ROI can be extremely high if done right.
Great, really, really interesting point. So what's the solution on this in your view?
Well, I think I presented in the talk, I showed a few ways that you can measure raw brand lift and sort of the lift that branded search sends, which often happens through advertising and brand programs. And I talked about how you can segment traffic geographically to sort of see how efforts in one country or one region might impact your efforts, and then infer from that the lift that you're getting. But this is, we're using words like infer and guess and estimate as opposed to flawless measurement.
Yeah.
And so many marketers and many CMOs will say, unacceptable, Rand is wrong, I don't want you investing in those things. And that's actually really good for you. That's really good for you because if everyone invested in those channels, they would be incredibly difficult. But since a ton of people don't believe in them and aren't willing to make that sacrifice and aren't willing to be able to go to their executive team or their board of directors and wave their hands and say, hey, we're going to invest in some speculative, estimated brand lift types of efforts, and I won't be able to show you perfect cost of acquisition on each channel. Since they don't have the courage to do that, you get much less crowded channels.
And so you moved on to the second thing, is that cultural conditioning leads us as marketers to believe that all channels must be ROI positive. And I find this one really interesting. And you used Moss Whiteboard Fridays as an example. Could you go into detail about your experience with this Whiteboard Friday and why you see this as a bias?
Yeah, sure. So it's dovetailing on the last one, but the basic concept is that when marketers make an investment in a new channel, they are often measured on the ROI of that channel against the other channels that they invest in a pretty small time frame. Sometimes it's a few weeks, sometimes a month, maybe a quarter. But in fact, the best way to measure those things is not we started a content marketing project, right? We started our blog, or we put together a news channel, or we put together a video series. And you know what? It's actually underperforming our AdWords spend this month. So we're going to shut it off. And that is a terrible, terrible way to invest in a channel's potential. What I instead am urging folks to do is I'm urging them to look at the trend line. Are you improving that channel's ROI over time? And if you were to continue its efforts for considerable period, many months, maybe a year, maybe two, would it be significantly more positive than the paid channels or other channels that you're measuring and investing in right now? Because if that's the case, you should be going negative in your ROI in the short term so that you can build up a powerful flywheel that produces ongoing customer attraction and marketing value in the long term with a very low cost of acquisition. And so by paying attention only to the raw numbers right now measured channel by channel, as opposed to the trend line of whether a channel is improving or whether you could estimate that it will improve, and then measure yourself against your estimated progress over months or years, you're really losing out. And I use the example of the Whiteboard Friday because that's exactly what happened with us. In the first, I think, year that Whiteboard Friday was active, it was our worst performing blog content every week, but we kept it up because we could see that we were getting better at it and that it had a special kind of engagement, and we wanted to do it. We wanted to get better at it. We figured if we kept investing, we could make some improvements. And a few years later, it was our best performing channel. Now it's dramatically, by far, our best performing content each week. And it's built an extraordinary audience for Moz and tens of thousands of people who engage with it, many of whom say that it's a big reason why they became customers.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Are there not just projects you have to shut down? Or should you really keep investing in every single project? How do you even find out? Here's Rand.
Yeah. So this is what's great about measuring against your estimated trend line. So let's say, you and I got together and we decided, hey, we're going to work on a podcast together. And we expect that by month 6, we are going to be able to attract at least 1,000 people every 2 weeks to our podcast, and that 20 of them or more will end up taking a free trial of our software, right? So that's our sort of estimate. We give ourselves 6 months to do it, and then we watch our trend line and how are we performing. And if in month 4 we're already getting 1,500 listeners and 25 people taking the free trial from each episode, we should high five. We should stick with that program, even if technically that channel costs us more time and energy than an equivalent channel where we're actually getting more free trials. Let's say our Facebook advertising program or something, which we have to put relatively little energy into, but we're sort of put an amount of spend against, and we get these numbers. But if we measure against a trend line, what we can see is that, hey, hang on. If we keep this podcast up for another 6 months, we're going to be dwarfing our Facebook ad numbers. And that's the way to invest, right? The way to invest is not a raw, single snapshot in time and comparing across that, but to look at overtime performance and potential improvement and what your trends are looking like. Because if you're growing a channel, as opposed to many advertising channels, which really are just a snapshot, there's a lot more potential in those.
Amazing. So really to not expect amazing results within the first month, yeah?
Yeah, and not to unfairly compare something that you've just started against a channel that has much less growth potential. Right, a channel with big growth potential, like a podcast or a blog or a video series, or a big brand marketing effort or a word of mouth effort, whatever it is, right? Those types of things have an incredible potential. Today's execution should not be measured against, your other channel's returns. What today's execution should be measured against is the estimate that you put together. So if you said, hey, we're going to invest in this channel so long as a year from now it can beat out all our other channels. And then you create the trend line that shows here's how we would have to perform, right? Here's how it would have to scale month over month in order for us to, in a year, have this much better performing channel. And then we measure ourselves against that. So month one, we don't look at, did we do better than our Facebook ads and our Google AdWords? We look at, did we do better than our estimate that in a year puts us on track to beat them all?
Really, really interesting. Really great input. So moving on to this third statement, which really made me smile because I could totally see myself saying that nearly as an excuse. Marketers are not technical. So what do you mean by that?
Well, but I think that marketers get biased to thinking because we're not software engineers, we are not technical, and therefore we are often afraid of A, giving input, and B, contributing to or getting involved in projects that we feel we're not qualified for. But in fact, I think that there's a strong case to be made that marketers are actually vastly more technical, especially web marketers, are vastly more technical than 99% of the population. We're just less technical than the engineers who build the software and hardware that we often rely on.
Yeah.
And so
why is this statement hurting us? I was wondering, is it a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it hurts us because it prevents us from making investments, from getting involved in projects, and from sort of shying away from contributions where, in fact, marketing input is essential. And that happens a lot of times on website development. It happens a ton on software development. It happens a lot in product development, where marketers say, well, you know what, I'm not the technical person, so I should stay out of those conversations. But in fact, marketing is a huge part of how great products are designed and built, how great websites are designed and built, how great software is designed and built. And so I think marketers need to involve themselves in those rooms and not be afraid of or biased to the idea that we are not technical. And I presented it, in the at Inbound. I showed a bunch of ways that you can, as a marketer, even if you feel non-technical, get involved in other ways, right? And that includes through training, right? There's lots of learn it yourself sorts of things on the web. That includes things like contracting. That includes things like insourcing, right? Recruiting someone from your team who is technical to work with you from the marketing perspective and provide the technical perspective, or to outsource to someone else, or to end around some of these technical issues. And I showed a few examples of that too.
That was all from E-Commerce Boost this week. This episode was only part 1 out of 2, so remember to subscribe and tune in next week to get part 2. In the second part of the interview with Rand Fishkin, we go through the final biases, including why search investments aren't necessarily SEO or PPC, what content marketing opportunities you're missing out on, and you'll also learn how to win back the traffic you thought you lost to Google. I'll see you next week.
This session of E-Commerce Boost was produced by Sleeknote. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on tactics and strategies that'll help boost your e-commerce.